He never ran for office. That was the first misconception. People assumed power required visibility. A podium, a campaign, a name on a ballot. He had none of that. And yet, when he entered certain rooms, decisions softened. Priorities shifted. Conclusions arrived faster. He was not introduced with titles, only context. This is someone you should listen to. That sentence carried more weight than any mandate. He built his influence quietly over decades, not by commanding, by aligning. He understood early that political power was fragile in public and indestructible in private. Elected officials changed, narratives shifted, cycles reset, but advisors remained. Consultants stayed. Frameworks survived. He placed himself there between urgency and policy, between crisis and response, between what could be said and what would actually be done. He didn't lobby in the traditional sense. He didn't ask for favors. He shaped options. When a minister faced pressure, he didn't tell them what to choose. He presented consequences. When a committee hesitated, he didn't persuade. He contextualized. Context, he knew, was power. He hosted dinners where nothing was decided and everything was influenced. Small groups, no press, no records. Ideas floated without attribution. Concerns were voiced without ownership. By the time proposals reached the public sphere, they already felt inevitable. That inevitability was his signature. No fingerprints, no documents, no speeches, just momentum. He told himself this was responsible governance, that elected officials needed insulation from chaos, that someone had to think long-term, and he was good at it. Too good. He noticed how easily people deferred to him, not because he demanded it, but because he removed uncertainty. In politics, uncertainty is terrifying. He provided clarity. Clarity is addictive. Soon, he wasn't just advising on policy. He was consulted on tone, timing, optics. He helped shape what could be said publicly by deciding what should never be said at all. This was never illegal. That mattered to him. Everything he did fit within rules written by people like him. 4. Pout like gentui enyexen yo chent action or entenchim. He didn't bribe, didn't threaten, he guided, and guidance leaves no evidence. When journalists asked who influenced a particular shift, names of officials appeared. Never his. He watched press conferences with detached interest. He recognized his ideas in someone else's mouth. That distance protected him. It also numbed him. He rarely saw consequences directly. Policies passed. Markets adjusted. Lives changed. But the effects were abstract, statistical, projected. Graphs replaced faces. He told himself this distance was necessary, that emotional proximity clouded judgment. He believed that until one decision didn't stay abstract, until something leaked through the layers of insulation, until power stopped feeling theoretical and began to feel personal. The room had no windows. That was intentional. No natural light. No reference to time. Meetings held there felt detached from consequence. Phones stayed outside. Notes were discouraged. Attendance was limited to people who already understood discretion. Nothing illegal was discussed. That was the rule. Everything happened one step before illegality. They didn't decide outcomes. They defined constraints. What was realistic? What was too costly? What would trigger backlash? Language mattered. People spoke in hypotheticals, scenarios, trade-offs. No one said people will suffer. They said there will be adjustment. No one said communities will collapse. They said market corrections. This vocabulary protected everyone, especially him. He learned to speak in ways that removed agency. That transformed choice into inevitability. When someone raised a moral concern, it was acknowledged, then absorbed. Yes, that's unfortunate. But given the circumstances were always present, urgent, non-negotiable. The public timeline never applied here. While citizens debated proposals not yet announced, outcomes were already being shaped. By the time something reached public discussion, the range of acceptable disagreement had been narrowed. That narrowing was his craft. He didn't silence voices. He preempted them. He watched how easily elected officials leaned on this structure. It freed them from responsibility. If something went wrong, it was the system, the economy, global pressure, never a person, never a meeting, never him. He told himself this was how modern governance worked. That complexity required layers. That transparency was naive, and for years, that logic held. Until one evening, after a particularly long session, someone mentioned a number, casually, a projection, an estimate of people who would be displaced by a policy shift. The number was large enough to be abstract, small enough to be dismissed. Someone joked that it was still less than previous adjustments. The room laughed politely. He didn't. Not because the number shocked him, but because, for the first time, he imagined it as faces, not statistics, not demographics, people. He couldn't explain why that moment landed differently. Nothing had changed in substance, only in proximity. The insulation cracked. He left the building later than usual that night. The city felt louder, messier. He passed a protest he hadn't known was scheduled. Signs raised, voices angry. He recognized the slogans. They were reacting to something he had helped shape. No one recognized him. That anonymity had always been protection. That night, it felt like accusation. He kept walking, but the distance he relied on had shortened. And once distance collapses, power begins to feel heavy. The consequence did not arrive as outrage. It arrived as paperwork. A briefing crossed his desk the next morning. Impact assessment, implementation timeline, risk mitigation, standard language, clean formatting. Buried halfway down the document was a case study, not a story, a scenario. A family-owned business affected by the policy shift. Employees reduced. Operations restructured. The wording was precise enough to remain impersonal, but something in it caught his attention. An address. He recognized it, not because it was famous, but because he had passed it countless times without noticing. Curiosity, once ignited, is difficult to contain. He looked it up. Photographs appeared. A modest storefront. A name painted by hand. Smiling faces from an outdated website. This wasn't supposed to matter. He had seen thousands of projections like this, but this one resisted abstraction. He read the document again, slower. This time, the language felt inadequate. Displacement, adjustment, reallocation. These words no longer softened impact. They obscured it. For the first time, He wondered who would explain this decision to the people affected. Who would tell them why it was necessary? Who would look them in the eye? The answer was obvious. No one. The responsibility would dissolve across committees, agencies, timelines. He wouldn't be blamed. He wouldn't be named. He would remain exactly where he was. Invisible. This realization unsettled him. Not because he wanted credit, but because he couldn't locate accountability. He began to feel something unfamiliar. Weight. Not guilt, yet pressure. The sense that something was being carried without a place to be set down. He attended the next meeting differently. He listened harder, spoke less. When scenarios were discussed, he noticed how quickly human elements were filtered out. How will this be perceived? What's the political cost? Never. Who will absorb this? He considered raising the question, not as accusation, as clarity. But clarity had consequences. Asking that question would shift the room, force discomfort, slow momentum. Momentum was sacred here. He stayed silent. That silence tasted different now, not strategic. Complicit. After the meeting, a colleague clapped him on the shoulder. Good call on narrowing the options, they said. He nodded automatically, but the praise landed wrong. It confirmed something he had been avoiding. He wasn't adjacent to power. He was part of its mechanism. And mechanisms don't get to feel. That night, he sat alone longer than usual. He didn't turn on the news, didn't check messages. He thought about the address again, about how many decisions had passed through rooms like his without ever leaving a trace of authorship. He wondered how many lives were quietly rerouted by people who never needed to explain themselves. And for the first time, he asked himself a dangerous question. If no one can see my hand, how do I know when to stop using it? He tried to introduce limits, not publicly, not dramatically. Internally, he began framing advice differently, less definitive, more conditional. Instead of narrowing options, he widened them. Instead of declaring inevitabilities, he emphasized uncertainty. The response was immediate and subtle. Meetings grew longer. Agendas tightened. People looked to him for resolution he no longer provided. The room became restless. Without clarity, discussion stalled. Without direction, anxiety surfaced. Someone finally said it out loud. We need guidance, not advice. Guidance. The word landed heavily. Guidance implied responsibility without attribution, influence without ownership, exactly what he had always provided. He realized then that the system didn't just tolerate his role, it depended on it. When he pulled back, pressure filled the vacuum. Others stepped in, less cautious, more decisive. Their suggestions were cruder, less nuanced. He watched as policies hardened. The options he had once shaped gently were now being decided bluntly. This disturbed him more than his own influence ever had. He told himself that by stepping back, he was allowing worse outcomes. That argument felt familiar. It was the same logic that had kept him involved for years. If I don't do it, someone less careful will. The system knew this. It rewarded hesitation with urgency. He attempted another approach. He asked for accountability frameworks, clear ownership, named responsibility. The reaction was polite and dismissive. That's not how things work. Complexity was cited. Plausible deniability disguised as efficiency. He saw then that his discomfort was not shared. Others slept well. The burden he felt was not inherent to the role. It was personal. And personal discomfort had no leverage here. He began to understand something unsettling. Leaving wouldn't dismantle the structure. It would only replace him. Perhaps with someone faster, less reflective, more willing. This realization created a trap. Staying meant continued complicity. Leaving meant relinquishing even the small restraint he exercised. There was no exit that felt clean. The system had been designed without exits, only transitions. He noticed how rarely anyone asked him what he believed anymore. They asked what he recommended. Belief was irrelevant. Effectiveness was currency. He had become effective at something he no longer believed in. That contradiction began to wear him down. He felt tension in his chest he couldn't place. Fatigue that didn't resolve with rest. He was not overworked. He was misaligned. The system didn't notice. Systems don't notice misalignment. They notice disruption. And he had not disrupted anything yet, but the thought that he might need to no longer felt theoretical. He began to see the system as something alive, not metaphorically, functionally. It adjusted, learned, compensated. Every attempt to soften its impact created a workaround. Every pause was filled, every doubt absorbed. He realized then that influence didn't belong to individuals. It flowed, and like any current, it followed the path of least resistance. For years, he had been that path, reliable, predictable, careful. The system trusted him because he reduced volatility. Now that he hesitated, volatility increased elsewhere. That knowledge weighed on him. He felt guilt. But it had no direction. There was no victim standing in front of him. No accusation. No single decision he could point to and say, "This is where I failed." The guilt was distributed across meetings, across years, across policies that blended into one another. He understood why people in his position often detached emotionally. Detachment was not cruelty. It was anesthesia. Without it, the mind would fracture under cumulative consequence. He had resisted detachment longer than most. Now he felt the cost. He started questioning whether his discomfort mattered at all. If outcomes were inevitable, was his presence at least reducing harm? This question haunted him. It was impossible to answer honestly, because harm wasn't measured in rooms like his. It was modeled, projected, deferred. He noticed how easily moral language disappeared under pressure. Words like responsibility and impact gave way to feasibility and risk. This shift didn't require malice, only urgency. Urgency was the system's favorite excuse. He wondered what would happen if he left. Not in theory, in practice. Would his absence slow decisions or accelerate them? Would someone ask harder questions or fewer? He feared the answer, not because it implicated him, but because it suggested he wasn't as important as he believed. That fear cut deeper than guilt. If leaving changed nothing, then staying had never been necessary. He wasn't preventing disaster, he was legitimizing it. This realization stripped away the last justification he had clung to. He wasn't the conscience of the system. He was its cover. The thought made him feel physically ill. He sat in meetings, now feeling detached from his own voice. When he spoke, he heard how measured he sounded, how neutral, how convincing. Others nodded, took notes, moved forward. Nothing in the room reflected his internal conflict. He understood then that the system would not collapse under ethical pressure. It would simply root around it. And that meant the choice in front of him was not about outcomes. It was about integrity, whether he could continue participating, knowing that his presence made everything feel acceptable. That question did not demand an immediate answer, but it did not go away. And questions that persist eventually demand action. He tried to leave quietly, not resignation, not rupture, reduction. He declined invitations that weren't essential, delegated influence where he could, shortened his presence. He told himself this was responsible disengagement. The system barely noticed. Meetings proceeded without him. Notes circulated. Decisions landed on schedule. Someone else filled his chair. They spoke with confidence. Less hesitation, more certainty. The work continued. This disturbed him more than resistance would have. No one asked why he was stepping back. No one expressed concern. His influence had not been unique. It had been convenient. The system did not mourn convenience. It replaced it. He watched from the margins as the tone hardened. Where he once suggested nuance, others delivered clarity. Where he once delayed, others accelerated. He realized then that gradual exit was a fantasy. There was no tapering off influence. There was only presence or absence, and presence, even restrained, still legitimized outcomes. He tried one last intervention, not to stop a policy, to slow it, to introduce review, human assessment, time. The request was acknowledged, documented, then bypassed. Urgency returned as justification. Delays have costs. That phrase sealed it. He understood then that the system interpreted caution as inefficiency. Efficiency was sacred. Ethics were optional. He felt something break quietly inside him. Not hope, illusion. The illusion that he could remain involved without being responsible. That illusion had kept him functional. Now it was gone. He realized that any continued participation, however minor, would make him complicit. Not because he agreed, but because he enabled. The clarity was brutal. There was no heroic exit, no moment of recognition, just a decision no one would applaud. He prepared himself mentally, not for backlash, for indifference. He knew that when he left, nothing would stop. No one would slow down to reconsider. The system would continue with equal momentum. That knowledge was devastating and strangely freeing, because it meant his departure was not about outcomes anymore. It was about authorship, whether he would continue to lend his credibility to decisions he no longer believed in, or whether he would accept that leaving meant losing relevance. That choice was no longer abstract. It was immediate and irreversible. He didn't announce his decision. There was no statement, no explanation circulated. He simply stopped showing up. Not dramatically, not defiantly, completely. The reaction was almost imperceptible. No emergency calls, no last-minute meetings. His calendar emptied itself with administrative efficiency. A few polite messages arrived, brief, neutral. Understood. Thank you for your time. Time. That word carried more meaning than intended. Years of influence condensed into a transactional goodbye. He realized then that power without office does not acknowledge departure. It absorbs it. The system adjusted within days. Names shifted. Responsibilities reassigned. Someone else occupied the role he had never officially held. There was no vacuum. There never is. He watched from a distance, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. He needed to understand whether leaving had changed anything. It hadn't. The policies he had helped shape moved forward unchanged. The language remained the same. The outcomes followed predicted paths. This confirmation hurt more than doubt ever could, because it meant the conflict had always been internal. The system had not required his conscience. It had tolerated it. And tolerance is not dependence. He felt a wave of insignificance pass through him. Not humiliation, not regret. Clarity. He had not been steering history. He had been smoothing it, making it palatable. That smoothing had been his true contribution. And now, without him, the edges were sharper, more visible, less disguised. He wondered briefly whether his presence had been a net good. The question had no answer. There was no control group for morality, only memory. He began to feel the consequences of absence in his own body. The constant tension in his chest eased. His sleep deepened. The mental rehearsal stopped. No more anticipating meetings that pretended to be neutral while shaping lives. No more translating moral discomfort into strategic language. The silence that followed his exit was not peaceful, but it was honest. He was no longer complicit. He was also no longer relevant. That duality settled heavily. He understood now why people in his position rarely left. Not because they couldn't, but because leaving stripped away both illusion and importance at once. He had chosen that stripping, and now he had to live inside what remained. Life after the back room felt unnervingly ordinary. There were no calls to return, no invitations framed as concern, no warnings about consequences. The world didn't retaliate. It moved on. He woke without urgency for the first time in years. No briefings waiting. No silent expectations to fulfill. At first, the quiet felt like relief. Then it felt like absence. He realized how much of his sense of worth had been tied to anticipation, to being needed before being seen, to knowing that decisions were waiting for him somewhere. Now, nothing waited. This emptiness forced a confrontation he had avoided his entire life. Who was he when no outcome depended on him? The question was not philosophical, it was practical. He noticed how conversations changed. People no longer asked his opinion instinctively. They spoke freely, without checking alignment. Disagreements surfaced without hesitation. This should have felt healthy. Instead, it stung. He mistook relevance for meaning for too long. Now that relevance was gone, meaning felt unreachable. He tried to re-engage socially, not politically, personally, but without context, he felt clumsy. He had spent decades speaking in abstractions. Now, everyday conversation required presence, listening without agenda, responding without calculation. This was harder than negotiating policy. He caught himself framing thoughts as recommendations, then stopping. No one needed guidance anymore. This realization was humbling and frightening. because it suggested that the world had never required his moral struggle. It had required his efficiency. Without that, he was optional. He grappled with a quiet resentment, not toward the system, but toward himself, for believing that staying had been a form of service, for confusing influence with responsibility. He understood now that stepping away did not absolve him. It simply removed him from the mechanism. Responsibility doesn't vanish with distance. It transforms. He began to feel something else emerge beneath the discomfort. A fragile curiosity. What would it mean to act without leverage? To contribute without shaping outcomes at scale? The idea felt small, almost humiliating. But it was honest. He started doing work that produced immediate, visible effects, helping one person, advising without authority, listening without steering. These actions didn't ripple outward. They stopped where they started. At first, this felt pointless. Then it felt grounding. He began to understand that power had trained him to ignore proximity. Scale had replaced intimacy. Now, intimacy returned. Slowly, awkwardly, he was no longer shaping futures he would never see. He was present for consequences he couldn't outsource. This presence was uncomfortable, but it was real, and reality, unlike influence, did not pretend to be neutral. The invitation did not come as an invitation. It came as a question. A former colleague reached out casually. No urgency, no agenda. They spoke about the state of things, about how complex everything had become, about how decisions felt rushed lately. Then the sentence appeared almost accidentally. We could really use your perspective. Not a role, not a title, just perspective. The word carried weight. Perspective had always been his entry point. The soft opening, the harmless contribution. He felt the pull immediately. Not ambition, familiarity, the ease of slipping back into relevance without responsibility, of influencing without being seen, of correcting excesses without owning outcomes. Just one conversation, he told himself. Just context. Just caution. He recognized the rationalization instantly. It was the same one he had used for years. The system didn't need him fully involved. It only needed him adjacent. Available. That adjacency was the real trap. He delayed his response, not strategically, intentionally. He sat with the discomfort the invitation stirred. The ego responded first, the relief of being wanted again, of being remembered as useful. Then came fear. If he refused, the door might close completely. If he accepted, the cycle would restart invisibly. He imagined the meeting, the familiar language, the careful hypotheticals, the relief in the room when clarity returned. He imagined walking out afterward, telling himself he had helped. He also imagined the quiet consequence, how his words would travel without him, how decisions would harden around them, how responsibility would evaporate again. This time, the image didn't feel abstract. It felt heavy. He realized something important. The temptation wasn't to regain power. It was to escape insignificance. That distinction mattered. Power had never been the drug. Relevance was. He replied with restraint. He thanked them, acknowledged the complexity, declined involvement, not permanently, not dramatically. Just no. The response was polite, understanding, brief, and then silence. That silence was different from the ones before. It didn't feel punitive or strategic. It felt final. He understood then that this was the true exit, not leaving the room, refusing to re-enter. He felt a mix of loss and relief wash over him. Loss of leverage, relief from coherence breaking. He had passed a test no one else could grade, and that made it real. He didn't know what would come next. He only knew what wouldn't. He would no longer be the invisible hand. And that decision, more than any policy he had ever influenced, was entirely his. After refusing the invitation, nothing dramatic happened. No backlash. No doors slammed shut. Just space. He hadn't realized how much of his life had been structured around reaction. Meetings responding to crises. Advice responding to urgency. Now there was nothing to respond to. This absence of stimulus created a strange discomfort. He found himself restless without knowing why, checking the time too often, expecting interruption that never came. Power had trained his nervous system. Urgency had been his baseline. Without it, his body didn't know how to settle. He began to notice how often he had confused stress with importance. Without constant demand, days felt longer, not emptier, slower. Slowness frightened him because slowness allowed reflection, and reflection invited memory. He remembered decisions he had once framed as necessary, how easily he had accepted trade-offs, how rarely he had questioned who absorbed the cost. These memories didn't accuse him. They lingered, like unresolved conversations. He understood now that stepping away from power doesn't erase its residue. It follows you internally. He tried to redirect himself toward learning, not policy, not strategy, something unrelated. He took classes that had no relevance to governance, read books without conclusions, engaged in discussions where outcomes didn't matter. At first, this felt indulgent. Then it felt necessary. He realized how rarely he had allowed himself curiosity without application. Everything had once needed utility. Now, utility was optional. This shift unsettled him. Without usefulness as a metric, how do you measure progress? He struggled with that question. There were days when he missed the clarity of decision-making, the simplicity of choosing between constrained options. Freedom was messier. He also noticed a quiet grief, not for power itself, but for the identity it had provided. Influence had given him definition. Without it, he felt diffuse, not lost, undefined. That undefined state tempted him to seek structure again. Any structure. He understood then why people return to systems that harm them. Structure feels safer than ambiguity. He encountered former colleagues occasionally, brief interactions, polite, surface level. They spoke of how things are now. He listened carefully. The language had shifted. Less caution, more certainty. Decisions were faster. Policies sharper. There was pride in efficiency. No one mentioned consequences. Not because they were cruel, because they were distant. He noticed how quickly detachment had filled the space he left behind. That observation stirred something uncomfortable. Was his presence ever restraint, or merely reassurance? He realized that restraint had never been structural. It had been personal. And personal ethics don't scale. This realization was sobering. It meant the system had never been ethical or unethical. It had been optimized, and optimization doesn't care who suffers. he felt a familiar urge rise, the urge to intervene, to soften edges, to explain nuance. He resisted it, not because he didn't care, but because he understood the pattern. Intervention would pull him back into relevance. Relevance would demand compromise. Compromise would dilute coherence. He was learning that the hardest part of leaving power was not the loss of influence. It was resisting the belief that you are still needed. And that belief, he understood now, was the last chain to break. He began to notice the legacy he could not escape. Not in headlines, not in acknowledgments, in phrasing. He heard his language repeated by others who had never met him. The same cautionary verbs, the same framing of inevitability. His influence had outlived his presence. This disturbed him more than relevance ever had. He realized that power does not end when participation ends. It persists in habits. Frameworks become defaults. Defaults become doctrine. He had helped build defaults, and those defaults now moved independently. This knowledge created a new kind of responsibility, one without tools. He could no longer intervene directly, could no longer recalibrate from inside. All he could do was observe, and observing without leverage felt like complicity delayed. He wrestled with a question that had no clean answer. Is leaving enough if what you helped shape continues unchanged? He knew the popular answer. No. But reality was less moralistic. Leaving had stopped future harm he would have enabled. It had not undone past alignment. That tension would remain. He learned to live with unresolved responsibility. Not absolved, not condemned. Aware. Awareness, he realized, was heavier than guilt. Guilt seeks resolution. Awareness endures. The final test arrived quietly. A crisis broke. Not unexpected. Not unprecedented. The system reacted with familiar speed. Decisions were announced before explanations. Consequences framed as unfortunate necessities. He watched coverage like a civilian. No calls, no briefings, just analysis. He recognized the contours instantly. The logic was intact. The language familiar. His fingerprints were nowhere and everywhere. For a moment, the urge to speak returned violently, to write something, to contextualize, to warn. He imagined drafting an op-ed, careful, measured, reasonable. He imagined the response, polite dismissal, accusations of hindsight, questions about motives. He deleted the imaginary draft. He understood something crucial then. Speaking now would not be courage. It would be nostalgia, a longing for relevance, disguised as responsibility. True responsibility, he realized, did not always mean intervention. Sometimes it meant restraint, letting systems reveal themselves without the comfort of familiar mediators. This realization hurt, because it meant accepting that harm would occur without his voice softening it. But it also meant respecting the boundary he had drawn. He could not dismantle what he had helped normalize by re-entering it. He could only refuse to legitimize it further. That refusal was quiet, invisible, unrewarded, and necessary. He closed the news, went for a walk. The city moved around him, indifferent. For the first time, that indifference didn't feel like erasure. It felt appropriate. He stopped asking whether leaving had been enough. That question had no answer that could be lived with. Instead, he began asking a different one. What does responsibility look like when you no longer have leverage? The answer was uncomfortable. It looked small, uncelebrated, invisible. He learned to live with the fact that some of the damage he had helped normalize would continue without him. Not because he failed to stop it, but because systems are not designed to remember who hesitated. They remember what worked, and what worked was distance. He accepted that his greatest influence had not been decisions, but the reassurance he provided, the reassurance that complexity excused harm, that inevitability dissolved guilt, that someone, somewhere, had thought it through. That reassurance had been the luxury of acting without seeing faces, of shaping lives without hearing names, of sleeping while consequences unfolded elsewhere. Now, without that luxury, life felt heavier, but clearer. He began to notice how often people seek power not to dominate, but to avoid responsibility. Influence distributes blame. Authority dilutes guilt. Stepping away had returned both to him in manageable doses. He no longer shaped futures at scale, but he could no longer hide behind abstraction either. When he helped now, he saw the outcome. When he failed, he felt it immediately. This intimacy with consequence was exhausting and honest. He understood then why power without office is so seductive. It offers impact without authorship, results without signatures, change without names attached. It allows people to feel effective without ever being accountable. Walking away from that felt like choosing vulnerability over relevance. He would never be invited back into the rooms that mattered. He would never be cited as a source. His ideas would continue without him. That was the final cost. Not obscurity, but continuity without consent. He had helped build something that no longer required him, and now he had to live as someone who knew how it worked and chose not to benefit from it anymore. That choice would never be visible. It would never be praised. It would never be proven necessary, but it would be his. And in a world where power hides behind complexity, that was the only form of integrity left.